Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today's video, 10 must-add players for Week 16 of the fantasy football season. The second weekend of the playoffs. I'm very happy you're here. We still got some people that have fantasy championships to win. Honestly, it was a very rough week last week for some of the picks I had and some of the players. I think Zay Jones might have been the worst take in the history of time. But we're on to another week here. Still have some teams for myself that are still playing. A couple on bye that I'm very thankful for. But we're going to go through waiver wire targets and each and every position this week. We have some deeper guys, less than 5% rostered. We have some guys for some of you that might not be available, but a lot of these guys are available for the most part, like 70, even 80% of leagues, a lot of these players. But again, we'll cover every position. If you guys are new to the channel, be sure to check out our friends over at Betfred. If you sign up at Betfred, deposit $50, bet $50, you're going to get $250 in free bets. If you're betting on the game tonight, Rams-Packers, we're getting this out before the game. I love Aaron Rodgers, over 225.5 passing yards. We saw the Rams really slow down the run game of the Raiders last week, and Josh McDaniels just wouldn't stop running it, and I think that's why they lost that game. The Packers with LaFleur, I think, can see that this is the best way to beat this Rams team is through the air. I think Rodgers does a great job tonight, so go look to play that over at Betfred. The link to sign up is down below in the description. Let's get to these waiver wire players, these must-add players this week. Let's get to the running back position first, starting with Tyler Algier, 37% rostered. Now, Algier coming off an excellent week. He outperformed Alvin Kamara, who continues to just stink it up for everybody's fantasy team. It's incredibly frustrating what we're getting from him this year. But regardless, he had 36 snaps to Cordarrelle's 37, so still didn't win the battle in terms of total snaps. Had 17 rush attempts to Patterson's 14. Turned his 18 touches into 136 yards and a touchdown. Great week, Algier. Great week. He's been excellent the last little bit here. Very efficient on the ground. Been the better runner than Patterson, no doubt about it. Was concerning to see Patterson get that red zone carry or that inside the 10 carry, I would say it was. I don't think they were inside the 5 and score, so we missed out on that. But here's the thing. I don't really want to bid on Algier. I want to save my bid for this next guy we'll talk about. Baltimore's up next. Like Tyler Algier is not someone you're going to play this week that's going to be able to help you win this fantasy matchup. They're 4th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. They're also allowing a league, I think it's the 3rd best, maybe the 2nd best, 67 rushing yards per game to running backs. Algier is feeling like unplayable regardless of the fact that Ritter and his lack of ability to complete passes and make plays with his arm. Besides the fact that's going to help them in terms of leaning more on the ground game, I don't know how efficient they're going to be on the ground. So Algier is someone you certainly can bid on and you could play because of volume only, but I'm not sure he'll be that successful this week. So a bit of concern with Algier, but I have to mention him. Next up, Zach Moss, 3% rostered. Man, guys, I thought we hit a absolute jackpot when Jonathan Taylor got hurt. That's kind of mean to say, but I said add Deion Jackson. Deion Jackson, add him. If Jonathan Taylor gets hurt, actually comes to fruition, and then Deion Jackson literally fumbled the bag. Like for his team, for us, for himself. He will now more than likely not be the number 1 back for the Colts, even though Moss was getting more work than he was, and Moss looked like shit. He had 24 rush attempts for 81 yards. It was like 3.4 a carry. Jackson looked better than him. He had 13 rushes for 55 yards, nothing crazy, but he looked better. And the problem is, though, that fumble is something that will not be lost on the coaching staff. Moss looks to be the go-to guy for this team. So I'm spending whatever my fab is left, I'm spending it on Zach Moss. No doubt about it, because I do think he's the number 1 option for this team. He even had more routes run than Deion Jackson, which was surprising too. So the Chargers are up next. They're one of the best teams for fantasy running backs, 29th in fantasy points, and they rank 31st in rushing yards allowed per game to running backs, 129. 129. We saw Derrick Henry have a good week as well. So Moss is my 100% fab. If I see Moss as a good start this week, and if you're someone that's maybe been going 0 RB throughout the season or like constantly been looking to the wire, this is the guy that's going to just be an automatic play for you. So definitely add Zach Moss, spend your fab, and just add this guy. This is my number 1 ad on the week. It's probably got to be everyone else's number 1 ad. But you can still hang on to Deion Jackson too. Hang on to Deion Jackson. He could be playable. But that is how I feel about the Colts backfield. Kyron Williams is my 3rd and final back, 28% rostered. Again, I'm recording before the game tonight, so a lot of this comes on speculation. But despite Akers' fumble last week on Thursday Night Football against the Raiders, Akers did maintain the edge in snaps 27-19. I really thought Kyren a couple weeks ago was going to take over, but seems like for some reason McVay's still good with Akers. Maybe Akers has improved a little bit as a pass protector, so they're willing to play him. Akers hasn't been very good, so I think there's still a chance Williams comes in. But really the reason I'm making Williams an add this week, like we did last week with Jackson, this time we have the assurance that Williams would be the 2 in this offense. Anything happens to Cam Akers, the Chargers are up in week 17, 29th in fantasy points, like we mentioned, rushing yards, all that good stuff. I looked at the position for potential guys to stash for next week. This is really the only one. I believe the Jets were the other option, and I can't remember who was the other one because we look at the Texans, the Browns, and the Seahawks. But all those teams didn't have a clear backup. You could add David Johnson potentially if something happens to Kamara. But regardless, I mean, the Saints haven't run the ball well this year at all. So he's the number one guy. If Carter is 70% rostered, but if he isn't rostered in your league, I would definitely add him. He managed to outsnap Zonovan Knight last week. Again, I've seen him dropped in a couple of my leagues. If he's available in yours, he would be my number 2 this week behind Zach Moss for sure. So something to keep an eye on for you. But that is the number one stash for me this week. Moving to wide receivers, Chris Moore, 19% rostered last 2 weeks. 19 targets, 14 receptions, 168 yards, 7 receptions per game, almost 10 targets per game. We're looking at a guy who could likely play yet another week without Brandon Cooks, without Nico Collins. Collins practiced or didn't practice at all the last 2 weeks. Cooks fit in a limited practice on Friday before the week started. Honestly, I think it'd be another week that the Texans are playing without both of these guys, and Moore will benefit. Tennessee is up next. We know the Titans are a money matchup for wide receivers, 32nd in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, dead last that is, and 28th in pass DVOA. To me, it makes Moore a guy in your deeper leagues at 19% rostered. You could potentially play this week as well. Next up, Marquise Goodwin. 3% rostered. This is one of those other deep league ads for you. Tyler Lockett expected to miss what will be for sure the rest of the fantasy season, but potentially the rest of the regular season as well. Last time, one of Lockett or Metcalf were absent. Metcalf played like 10 snaps and then left with an injury. Was week 7, I believe. Goodwin went from 5 targets, 4 receptions, 67 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Marquise Goodwin's a capable player. He's looked pretty good this season as the wide receiver 3 for the Seahawks, and he plays a very similar role to Lockett. Him and Lockett find themselves flip-flopping between the outside and the slot, so this won't be much of a change of role for Goodwin, but I expect his target share to increase significantly as the wide receiver 2 for this team, especially with the Chiefs on deck. The Chiefs, 28th in fantasy points allowed, and allow the most touchdowns per game to wide receivers. This Seahawks team, 9.5-point underdogs on the road in Kansas City. Likely a game script where they will need to lean on the pass. But without Lockett, you could see Ken Walker have a good game as well. But I expect Goodwin to play a pretty significant role in this passing offense this coming week in Week 16. Next up, a wide receiver, Richie James. 14% rostered, the number 1 slot option for the Giants. He's asserted himself in that role with Wan'Dale Robinson leaving for the season. So I do like what he can do. Led the team with 42 receiving yards last week. Nothing to write home about, but serviceable numbers in your deeper leagues. Minnesota is the next team up, 31st in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, including the most yards allowed to wide receivers, 208.4 just to the wide receiver position. So a very, very, very good matchup for the Giants, who will probably struggle to run the ball against the Vikings. The Vikings boast a very good run defense. We saw it against the Colts last week. That's the reason they were able to stay in that game and ultimately complete the best comeback in NFL history. And then we've got for the Giants road underdogs, also indoors in Minneapolis. So I expect this team to lean on the pass quite a bit, and it's good conditions for it. So James could be a sneaky ad for you this week. Last one up, definitely more of a stash for me on the potential, Demarcus Robinson, 14% rostered. He's asserted himself as the wide receiver 1 for this team. He has 44 targets the last 7 weeks. That's good for 6.3 per game. Here's the deal, though. We need Lamar Jackson. Like, we're not trusting Tyler Huntley to be the quarterback for Demarcus Robinson if we expect him to be an efficient guy for your fantasy team. And of course, I included all of these last 7 weeks in some of this data because I want to know between Huntley and Jackson where those numbers come from. So it's still good when Jackson's on the field. He's led the team in routes run, I think, the last 3 straight weeks as well. So it seems like Robinson's the number 1 guy here, of course, behind Mark Andrews. But the next 2 weeks are money for wide receivers. And if Lamar Jackson's back, could be a league winner. Atlanta and Pittsburgh are the next 2 weeks. Atlanta, 27th in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, 29th in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers are the Steelers. They both rank outside the top 20 in coverage grade as well from PFF. So a good matchup the next 2 weeks. If Lamar Jackson's healthy, Robinson is definitely worth an ad, speculatively, even on the wire this week for very little bid. No one's going to be really interested in him other than you from watching this video. Tight end. 2 guys quickly let's get to, and then we'll get to our quarterback with the last one. Chigoziem Okonkwo, 29% rostered. Did I nail the name? I don't really know, but definitely someone we got to pay attention to. He's led the team in receptions in 3 straight weeks. He's had 9+ PPR fantasy points in those weeks as well. That's certainly valuable to you. I know I'll take 10 fantasy points from the tight end each and every week and wipe my hands of it. I would love to have that. So he's been able to do it the last 3 weeks, basically. Treylon Burks' concussion has lasted another week. He didn't play last week. He didn't practice at all last week. I'm starting to think that this could continue for yet another week. If that's the case, that's very good for him because he's at a 26.3% target rate the last 4 weeks. Very nice. Like, when he's on the field, he's earning volume from Ryan Tannehill, so it's good to see. Houston's up next. Not a crazy good matchup. They're allowing about 50 receiving yards per game to the tight end position. We'll take that. If Okonkwo gives us 5 receptions, 50 yards, again, wipe my hands of it. I'll be a happy guy. That can help me win a fantasy title. Juwan Johnson, 20% rostered. This dude has, just pulling a rabbit out of his ass all the time this season. He has 7 touchdowns on the year. This week, listen to this. He turned 13 routes into 6 targets, 4 receptions, 67 yards, and 2 touchdowns. What is that? What is 6 divided by 13? I'm not even sure. It's got to be like 45%, something like that, target rate. His ADOT, 9.2 yards, is 4th amongst tight ends. I mean, this guy's just finding ways to help you fantasy-wise. Like, if he's still available in your leagues, it's not a great matchup against the Browns. A man matchup. This is like the lowest total of the week. I saw it was 31.5 at Betfred. It actually made me laugh. I was surprised to see it. So not a lot of potential for points in this game. But Johnson, I mean, sometimes you're just pulling out whatever you can to get whatever you can from the tight end position, and you don't really know what's going to happen. This guy could score 3 touchdowns in the blink of an eye. So Johnson could be a potential ad for you at the tight end spot this week. Last, quarterback, Daniel Jones, 59% rostered. I know I'm above the 50% threshold, but quite frankly, I don't feel comfortable recommending Davis Mills, Zach Wilson. Who else is in a good matchup? Sam Darnold. I don't want to recommend those guys to play this week. So there's some quarterbacks who are really bad in good matchups that I'm worried about recommending. There's a good chance for a lot of you, Jones is available if you're not in a super flex league. So he's a good start this week. Minnesota is up. I mentioned about Richie James. Same kind of goes here for Daniel Jones. 25th in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks are the Vikings, and a league worst 302 passing yards allowed per game. So very good matchup for Daniel Jones here. Like I mentioned, this team will likely lean through the air, and Jones has been able to give you 30, 40 rushing yards per game too to kind of elevate his floor. So I like him as a guy to stream this week if you need it at the quarterback spot. So those are our 10 guys that you can add on the wire for this week in fantasy football. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know. Drop a comment down below with any players you're considering dropping, but subscribe to the channel as well if you enjoyed. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.